All right. Well, what I'm going to do for you this morning is I'm going to start with a quick overview of the national economy, just to give you a little bit of context. And then I'm going to focus in on Ohio. This coming July, the expansion that we're in hits the 10-year and 1-month mark. And why that's such a signal date is that it will then become the longest expansion in American history. And the national level forecasts are for at least another year of growth. And so it is very, very likely that we are going to hit that milestone. Now, every quarter, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve sends out a survey to people who forecast the national economy. And their first quarter survey attracted responses from 36 economists. And so what they do is they take these responses and they average them, which gives us a really nice kind of middle of the road idea of what people are thinking. And one of the questions that they asked was, what is the likelihood of a down quarter over the next 5 quarters? And it turns out that the odds of a down quarter, according to these economists, are under 20% through the 4th quarter of 2019. The 1st quarter of 2020 is only 22%. So we've got a good bit of runway left. I should, of course, caution you that there's always the chance of something unforeseen happening, and recessions can come on without a whole lot of warning. So we have to keep our eyes peeled, but there's no reason right now to think that we're going to run out of growth over the next year. So what I have here is a chart of annualized quarterly growth in gross domestic product, the sum total of all goods and services produced in the US. This is a quarterly chart that begins in 2016. The blue bars to the left are GDP. The purple bars are consumer expenditures. We really like to focus on consumer expenditures because they're 71% of the overall economy. And the hatched bars to the right are the average forecast for GDP growth from the Philadelphia Fed survey through the 1st quarter of 2020. The forecast for the 2nd quarter is 2.4%. 2.2% in the 3rd and 4th quarters, and 2.1% at the beginning of 2020. Now, 1st quarter growth was a real shocker to everybody. It was 3.2%. The Philadelphia Fed forecast was for less than 2%. And so this really caught everybody off guard. And it turns out, though, that there is somewhat less to this 3.2% than meets the eye. The first point is something that you can see on the chart. Over the last 3 quarters, we've had a troubling decline in consumer expenditure growth. The 1st quarter growth was 1.2%. And so that growth rate has declined by 2/3 in the last 3 quarters. And durable goods, goods that are expected to last for more than 3 years, actually contracted in the 1st quarter. And that contraction subtracted about 0.4 percentage points off of total growth. Durable goods are a mainstay of the Ohio economy. And so that result was not at all good news for us here in Ohio. Turns out that a full percentage point of that 3.2% growth was due to net exports, exports minus imports. That's one of the most volatile components of GDP. So we cannot expect that to hold in coming quarters. And it's also a component that can be revised relatively substantially. And so the revisions to this 3.2% estimate over the next 2 months, when they bring out their second and third estimates of first quarter growth, may be pretty sizable. We'll just kind of have to wait and see. Another point is that 0.7% percentage points of the 3.2% was due to inventory buildup, which has been building for the last 3 quarters. That adds to growth now, but subtracts from growth later. So one thing that might make the decline in consumer expenditures a little bit less worrisome is that consumer confidence is holding. What I have here is the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index. This chart is monthly, beginning at the beginning of 2007, and the shaded area there is the recession. As you can see, the index from month to month is really volatile, but the overall trend recently is kind of flat to very slightly upward. Contrast that with the very steep decline that we saw in consumer confidence going into the recession, almost a month or almost a year before the recession started. Consumer confidence started to decline. So that is at least a positive sign that we may see a return to growth in consumer expenditures. So let me now narrow the focus to Ohio. This is the trend in Ohio and US total employment growth from February 2010 through March of 2019. February 2010 is when employment bottomed out and started increasing again after the recession ended. What I've got here is a graph on an index basis. And so what this is showing is cumulative percentage growth in US employment, which is the black line, and Ohio employment, which is the blue line. Ohio has added a touch less than 600,000 jobs over the last 9 years, and that gives us net growth of 12% in employment. The US, though, is up more than 16%. As you can see, we started out growing a little bit faster than the US average. For 3 years in a row, we were either at or above the US trend. And that's the first time we've managed that since the late 1940s. So that was a really unusual period. But beginning in the spring of 2012, growth started to slow. Between then and March 2019, Ohio employment grew 7%, but US employment grew more than 11%. Now, you may have heard last year that Ohio's employment gains had really picked up and were starting to beat the national average again, and that in October, we finally beat the record high employment total that was set back in May 2000. And we all felt very good about that. Sadly, though, all that was based on preliminary estimates that were revised downward pretty substantially in March. So the current estimate is that Ohio's gain from December 2017 to December 2018 was only 0.8% compared to 1.8% for the US. And we still have 36,000 jobs to go before we beat the May 2000 record. And at our current pace, that's going to take us another year. But it turns out that this all really isn't telling the story. What I always like to say when I'm describing the Ohio economy is that there is no such thing as the Ohio economy. We are actually a collection of very localized economies with very different dominant industries and very different economic performance. The common idea is that there's Central Ohio and everywhere else. And to some extent, that is a true statement, because Central Ohio's economic performance over the last decade has been so far greater than the rest of the state, and in fact, greater than the national average, that it meaningfully increases statewide average employment and population growth. What I have here is my employment chart again, and I've got a new little dashed line down there at the bottom, which is the 5.6 million jobs of Ohio less the 1.1 million jobs that we have here in Central Ohio. And as you can see, that really deflates the employment growth of the rest of the state. We're at 10% rather than 12%. So that's Columbus versus the rest of the state. But beyond that, it turns out that Toledo is different from Cleveland, and Cleveland is different from Akron, even though Cleveland and Akron are only 30 miles apart, and so forth throughout the state. This is an illustration of what I'm talking about. This shows the indexed employment growth of Ohio's 6 big metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs, since early 2010. MSAs are collections of counties that are defined by the federal government based on commuting patterns. So an MSA is, in a very real sense, an economic unit. And so the 6 metros I have here are Akron, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, and Toledo. Akron's in 2 counties. Dayton and Toledo are in 3 counties. Cleveland is in 5 counties. Columbus is in 10, and Cincinnati's in 15. Cincinnati's MSA is in 3 states, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, but about 80% of total Cincinnati MSA employment is in Ohio. The straight black line there at the second highest point is the US. That's much smoother than the individual MSA trends, which are bouncier simply because of sampling error. And this chart shows that only one of these MSAs, namely Columbus, the red line there, has had economic growth, employment growth, significantly greater than the national average. Columbus growth over this period has totaled 21% versus the 16% national average. Cincinnati, right below the US line, is a distant second, 9-year growth of 15%. The other 4 MSAs are kind of hanging out between 8% and 11%. And there are 6 other smaller MSAs that are based in Ohio, either partly or completely within the state. And as you can see, these are much worse off. The best of them, which is the line on top, Canton, is up 10.5% since February 2010. Lima, Mansfield, and Springfield, which are kind of there in the middle, have gained only 3 to 4% in employment over the last 9 years. Youngstown employment, which is the second from the bottom, is up only 0.5%. Steubenville, down there at the bottom, is off more than 10%, but at least Steubenville employment has stopped declining. That's the one saving grace. Now, as far as Youngstown's concerned, they are experiencing a huge blow with the shutdown of the Lordstown GM plant, which is just north of into Trumbull County. And that is going to be absolutely cataclysmic for the Youngstown economy. I did some quick calculations, very informal, looking at the impact of losing not only the plant, but also all the secondary businesses, including the businesses that were meeting the needs of the households of the workers. And it looks to me like that shutdown could blow a 10% hole in their employment and their GDP. So it is a really, really serious problem, not just for Youngstown, but for the state. Unfortunately, we don't have current numbers on employment growth in Ohio's rural areas. The 2018 averages are going to be out this summer. Now, I do a bi-monthly article for Hannah News Service that talks about various aspects of the state's economy. The August issue always uses the new estimates when they just come out to do a regional analysis of employment growth. And so last August, I looked at the growth of these more rural regions between 2010 and 2017, and they were definitely a mixed bag. My East North Central region, which includes Amish country, beat the state and every MSA except Columbus. It's done quite well. Western Ohio, outside of Dayton, was only slightly below the state average, but the southeast part of the state, Appalachian Ohio, came in about 2/3 the state average, and the south, which wound up being less than half the state average. Now, Ohio's relatively weak employment growth has persisted not just in this expansion, but over the last 40 years. And in my opinion, there are two primary interrelated causes of that slow growth. And the first cause is Ohio's focus on manufacturing. Manufacturing has dominated Ohio's economy for decades. Manufacturing doesn't have the largest number of jobs. Statewide healthcare and government each have more jobs than manufacturing, but manufacturing's employment concentration is so far above average that it is the primary reason why Ohio employment changes differ from national employment changes. Manufacturing employment statewide is almost half again as high as you would expect in an economy Ohio's size. The manufacturing employment share is far above average throughout the state in all the individual regions, except in Central Ohio and the Southeast. Employment in manufacturing is 16% less in the Columbus MSA than you would expect in an economy our size, and only just slightly above average in the Southeast. But the concentration in some of the smaller MSAs and rural regions can be 2 to 3 times what you would expect. The manufacturing share is generally higher in the smaller MSAs than in the larger ones. Manufacturing plants need large developable tracts, and large tracts of land are generally cheaper around smaller cities. This also explains why the manufacturing share is relatively low in Southeast Ohio. The terrain makes large flat parcels relatively uncommon and developmental costs relatively high. So here is the manufacturing employment trend since February 2010. Again, the black line is the US, the blue line is Ohio. And this explains in its entirety the trend that I showed you earlier. Ohio's manufacturing employment grew far faster than the state average or the national average through mid-2012, and then it slowed to approximately average afterward. Notice that both state and national employment trends flattened in mid-2015 and then took off again in 2017 and 2018. However, since mid-2017, Ohio manufacturing employment's up 2.2%, while the US is up 3.3%, which again explains the recent weakness in Ohio employment growth. On the other hand, here's what happened during the last expansion to manufacturing employment, 2003 to 2007. US manufacturing employment through that period declined 5.9%, but the Ohio decline was 10.6%. That hit Ohio employment hard, both because of the larger than average decline in employment and manufacturing's larger than average concentration. So during this expansion, total employment nationally grew 6.3%, which was nothing particular to write home about, but the employment growth was only 0.2% in Ohio during that entire expansion. But manufacturing employment, as many of you probably know, is especially unhelpful in indicating the health of manufacturing companies. And this chart I have here shows you why. This goes from 1997 to 2007. The downward trending line is manufacturing employment. The upward trending line is manufacturing output. So manufacturing employment during this decade declined 20%. The output of manufacturing firms rose 43%. And what was going on was technology was substituting for labor that allowed fewer workers to produce more goods. Output per worker doubled over this period, which is an increase in productivity that's absolutely off the charts. And it may be that the increase in manufacturing employment that we've been seeing in this expansion is because the reduction in employment before and during the recession went too far. But over the long run, technology is going to continue to improve and will continue to substitute for labor. That's happening in more and more industries, not just manufacturing. Manufacturing, and for that matter, agriculture, are just the first two examples. Please note, though, that I am not saying that a manufacturing focus is a bad thing. It is just a thing. We need to recognize that focus, recognize its impact, and plan our economic growth with that in mind. It definitely makes our economy more cyclical. The second reason, I think, that Ohio's employment has been so weak over the last 40 years is our very slow population growth. What I have here is a chart that compares Ohio's population growth, right there at the top is Ohio, to the US, which is the black bar second down, to the 6 big metro areas. Total growth over the 18 years that I've charted this, from 2000 to 2018, is for Ohio 2.6%. The US 15.4%. Columbus is again an outlier with growth of 25%. Ohio's population has increased 336,000 since 2000, total growth of 3%. But the Columbus MSA has increased 431,000. So the population of the rest of Ohio, on balance, has declined by 95,000 since 2000. Cincinnati, including Kentucky and Indiana counties, gained 9.5%. Akron's next down with a gain of about 1%. Dayton has broken even after a couple years of growth. Toledo has lost 2.5%. Youngstown, or Cleveland rather, lost 4.2%. And all of the smaller MSAs lost population. Steubenville and Youngstown have both lost 11% since 2000. One somewhat hopeful sign, though, is that Mansfield, which is only Richland County, increased 500 in 2018. Its first gain since at least 2000, and probably much earlier than that. The Springfield MSA, my hometown, which is only Clark County, is still losing, but at a much slower rate over the last couple years than it was losing earlier. Slow population growth leads to a lack of available workforce for the companies that want to expand. Attracting companies and their jobs to Ohio is all well and good, but it turns out that the expansion of existing companies is what really matters. Over the last 20 years, more than 80% of Ohio's total job growth was driven by existing employers' expansion. If the labor force isn't growing, neither can the companies that are trying to hire. I think this is probably the major reason why our manufacturing growth has been less than average, at least for much of the recent history. Simply put, manufacturers are starved for workers. And this, unfortunately, is a problem that's going to continue. This chart shows you past and projected growth in 4 big age groups in Ohio between 2000 and 2050. The future growth comes from state projections. The light blue line, second from the bottom, is 24 and younger. 25 to 44 is purple there down on the bottom. 45 to 64, that line that increases and then falls, is second from the top. And then at the top, you have the population 65 and older. The dashed gray line is total population growth. And so what this chart is very clearly showing is that what growth the state will have over the coming decades will be driven by the senior population. That population is projected to be 142,000 more in 2040 than it was in 2017, an increase of 53%. That population was 13% of all people in Ohio in 2000. It's 15.5% now, but it's going to top out at more than 20% in 2035 before it starts to decline as we baby boomers start to die off. Meanwhile, the working age population, if you can't say something nasty, don't say anything at all. That's the Economist creed. The projections imply that the working age population is going to decline. You saw a big drop in the 25 to 44 group since 2000. That's been offset, fortunately, recently by an increase in the 45 to 64 group, but the projections imply that that gravy train is about to stop. The 45 to 64 group is now starting to decline as its members age into the senior population, and meanwhile, the 25 to 44 group is barely going to grow at all. So the population between 25 and 64, essentially the working age population, will be 455,000 smaller in 2030 than it was in 2015, a net decline of 7.5%. In any event, the slower increase in the working age population is a national phenomenon, although probably not to this extent. So we can expect more and more and more jobs to be replaced by technology. And it's an open question whether the technology wins or the decline in the working age population wins. The second reason why slow population growth is a problem is its net impact on business growth in general. There are broad swaths of the economy that serve a local market: retail, restaurants, business and personal services, a whole lot of healthcare, and more. And so if the population base isn't expanding, individual companies can only grow by poaching customers from their competitors, and so total regional growth stagnates. So where do we go from here? The risk of negative tariff impacts is real. Trump ramped up his tariff tweets again earlier this week. Existing and threatened tariffs hit Ohio much harder than they hit other places. Another impact that's going to weigh on Ohio's employment growth is slower Columbus growth. I have never formally done a forecast of Ohio employment, but I've been doing one for the Columbus region, Central Ohio, for the last 20 years. Last year was the first time since 2007 when Columbus employment growth was less than the national average. And the problem seems to be that our employment growth is finally maxing out our workforce availability. I'm predicting only 1.2% growth in 2019, down from the mid-twos a couple, 3 years ago. That's going to pull Ohio growth down rather than pulling it up. We have to address the workforce problem. That is probably the major problem that we in Ohio face. And an important task there is to induce more people to move here. And that includes immigrants, who are an important component of total statewide growth, and indeed growth in Central Ohio too. We also need more graduates from our colleges and universities to stay put after they graduate. Career-focused internships are a really, really great way of doing that. So that is what I wanted to share with you. Thanks a lot for listening. I don't know. Thank you. Any time for questions? Okay. Yes.
I guess I appreciate your analysis that Ohio is a collection of local, regional economies, that there's differences among the big Northeast Ohio compared to Columbus region. Do you think our economic development incentive that we're using statewide, Northeast Ohio talks a lot about legacy, brownfields, aged infrastructure, things like that. Yet those programs sometimes are very difficult to do. So, as a state, do you think we offer the right portfolio of incentives to deal with it?
Well, as it turns out, I guess about 3 or 4 years ago, I partnered with the Greater Ohio Policy Center to do an economic impact analysis on brownfields. And the benefits of providing incentives to remediate brownfields are really strong. And on top of that, there's the kind of unmeasurable impact on community, just the community fabric, the look and feel of the community. So that's certainly something that I really, really hope is going to ramp back up. Anything else? Going once? Yes, Mark.
But the cause and effect between brownfield revitalization and attracting people into the state or getting or educating people to stay is not, you're not saying there's a cause and effect there?
No, not necessarily. Although it certainly helps if a big, ugly, seeping brownfield is removed from the middle of a relatively small city. It just opens up land for development, keeps communities more compact, and just the activity itself generates jobs and income and wealth. Yes.
You said at the end that internships are a good idea to bring people in.
One of many.
Do you have any specifics on that, on how maybe companies could be incentivized to offer more internships, be more active in that arena? Any examples that you're aware of?
Well, long ago in a galaxy far away, I was economist at the Columbus Chamber of Commerce. And we had a very active program at the time, not only incentivizing internships, but helping companies get the most out of their interns. I had a steady stream of interns, and I put them to work. So the thing that you don't want to do is hire an intern who gets coffee and runs copies and stuff like that. You got to get them to do real work. And that can be a bit of a barrier for some companies because they don't have the time. But you invest a little time and your workload diminishes. Yes.
If you or anyone in Ohio given any thought to the message, the implications of the Japanese economy and its aging population for Ohio?
You better believe it. I've certainly talked about it and thought about it. The point is that the Japanese economy is in worse shape than we are, as far as the aging of the population goes. Part of the reason for that is their very, very restrictive immigration policies. And so I'm really concerned about the turn that we're taking these days as far as welcoming immigrants to our country. I was talking about this problem, and others were 10 years ago. And I was saying it's coming down the pike, be prepared, and by golly, here it is. So yeah, that's a very powerful message. Yes.
You didn't talk much about minimum wage. What will the minimum wage do?
The minimum wage is not an easy question, one way or the other. The people who say it will lead to no job loss are wrong. The people who say that it will lead to every job being lost are wrong. It's somewhere in the middle. And it's a very, very complex interaction of the productivity of individual occupations, the productivity of workers, the impact of losing some jobs to to the jobs that remain, and also the greater spending power of the workers. So people have actually asked me to do an economic impact on increasing the minimum wage. And I looked at it and I thought about it and I read some background materials, and I wound up just throwing up my hands and saying it's too complicated. I can't model it. So that is kind of a non-answer, but that's what I know. Yes.
Give some examples. You said how Columbus is outpacing a lot of the other states, other cities, or manufacturing cities. What about specifically Finland, or a little bit more of a white collar city with Marathon there? How is that on the your scale?
I don't know. Findlay is obviously part of the region that I'm looking at. My guess is it's probably fairly good, simply because you've got areas of Western Ohio, which is what that area is, what Hancock County is, I do believe, that really aren't doing very well. And so my guess off the top of my head is that Findlay's probably doing fairly well, but I'd have to go and look at the number. Yes.
I work with a lot of communities in southeastern Ohio, and there's definitely a mindset for manufacturing.
Right.
And trying to encourage manufacturing, probably going back to better days. Do you have any thoughts about how we might be able to encourage them to diversify beyond just basic manufacturing?
It's a hard nut to crack, simply because they figure that manufacturing was the gravy train before, and all they have to do is, as you say, bring it back and they'll be all right. Springfield has done a very interesting job of diversifying its economy. They brought in the Speedway headquarters. They've gotten into financial services. They've attracted a big call center for insurance, Code Blue, I think it's called. The problem is educational attainment, which is not good in Clark County, nor is it good in any of the surrounding counties except Greene, and everybody in Greene County works either at the base or in Dayton. And so that is probably the most serious stumbling block that you've got to diversifying your economy, simply because so many jobs in other sectors require at least a 2-year degree. Yeah.
Is this recent interest in improving broadband access throughout rural world?
Yeah, right.
Is there any logic to that? Is it going to really work or not?
It will certainly attract more companies, simply because that's, I mean, it's a utility just like water and electricity are. It's also going to help with education, simply because students and adult learners will have access to better internet connectivity. So it will have benefits. There's no doubt about it. I haven't looked deep enough to quantify them, but it certainly makes sense to me. All right.
Thanks, Bill. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.